Sometimes the most broken hearts make room for the most unexpected miracles. In 1889 Montana, mountain man Fletcher Quinlan has spent years running from the pain of losing his own family, finding peace only in the wilderness. One morning, deep in the forest, he hears something that stops him cold, the cry of an abandoned child. But this isn't an ordinary child. The infant has thick hair covering its tiny body and eyes that seem almost human. Despite everything telling him to walk away, Fletcher can't ignore a helpless child in need. He brings the strange little one back to his cabin and cares for it through the night. When morning comes, he steps outside to find massive figures standing in the mist around his home. These towering creatures have come for the child, but are they angry parents seeking revenge, or something else entirely? What happens when a lonely man's act of kindness changes everything he thought he knew about the world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pines like memories Fletcher Quinlan couldn't quite shake. He stood on the porch of his hand-built cabin, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the sun paint the Montana peaks in shades of gold and amber. 3 years had passed since he'd fled to these mountains. 3 years since the fever took his wife Margaret and their 2 children, little Samuel and baby Catherine. 3 years of learning to live with the hollow ache that had settled into his chest like a stone. At 54, Fletcher had seen enough of the world to know that some wounds never truly heal. They just learn to live quietly alongside a man's daily routines. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering pines, 15 miles from the nearest settlement of Copper Falls, accessible only by a winding deer trail that he'd widened just enough for his packhorse. The isolation suited him. Up here, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and sky, he could almost forget the sound of his children's laughter echoing through empty rooms. The cabin itself was a testament to Fletcher's determination to build something lasting with his own hands. Thick pine logs, chinked with clay and moss, formed walls that could withstand the brutal Montana winters. A stone chimney rose through the center, built from river rocks he'd hauled up the mountainside, one by one. Inside, the single room was spartanly furnished but comfortable. A bed he'd crafted from lodgepole pine, a rough-hewn table where he took his meals, shelves lined with books salvaged from his former life. On the mantel above the fireplace sat his most precious possession, a wooden relief he'd carved during the long winter nights, depicting Margaret's gentle face flanked by the cherubic features of Samuel and Catherine. The carving wasn't perfect. His hands had been made for handling rifles and reins, not delicate woodwork, but it captured something essential about the family he'd lost. Fletcher had been a cavalry scout before tragedy changed his path, riding with the 7th Infantry through campaigns that took him from the Dakota Territory to the Apache Wars in Arizona. He'd learned to read the land like a book, to track both game and men across terrain that would confound lesser outdoorsmen. Those skills served him well now in his hermit's existence. He could bring down an elk at 300 yards, set snares that never failed to catch rabbits for his stew pot, and read weather patterns days in advance. His garden, carved from a small clearing behind the cabin, provided vegetables that he preserved for winter. A small herd of goats supplied milk and cheese. He'd built a life that required nothing from the outside world, except occasional trips to town for salt, ammunition, and the few luxuries he allowed himself: coffee, tobacco, and books. The solitude had been a balm at first, a blessed relief from the pitying looks and awkward condolences of well-meaning neighbors. But as the seasons turned, Fletcher began to understand that healing and isolation were uneasy bedfellows. He found himself talking to the goats, carrying on one-sided conversations with the carved faces on his mantel, sometimes speaking aloud just to hear a human voice in the profound quiet of the mountains. He'd grown a full beard that was now more silver than brown, and his hair had turned the color of iron. His reflection in the cabin's single mirror showed a man who looked older than his years, carved lean by hard living and marked by loss, Yet there were moments of unexpected grace. Mornings like this one, when the light struck the peaks just so, and he could feel something larger than his own grief stirring in his chest. The mountains had their own ancient rhythm, indifferent to human sorrow, but somehow comforting in their permanence. He'd learned to find peace in small things, the return of the ptarmigan each spring, the way fresh snow made the world seem newly born, the satisfaction of splitting a winter's worth of firewood with precise, methodical swings of his axe. Fletcher had developed routines that gave structure to his days. He rose before dawn, tended to the goats, and walked a circuit around his property to check for signs of predators or weather changes. After breakfast, he might hunt or fish if supplies were low, tend his garden, or work on the endless maintenance that cabin life required, repairing chinking, splitting kindling, mending tools. Evenings were for reading by lamplight, sometimes making entries in the journal he'd kept since arriving in the mountains. He wrote about weather patterns, game movements, the changing seasons, but rarely about the deeper currents of his inner life. Some things were too large for words. The nearest town, Copper Falls, consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a dozen houses clustered around a played-out silver mine. Fletcher made the journey perhaps once a month, leading his packhorse down the mountain trail to trade furs and jerky for supplies. The townspeople knew his story. Tragedy had a way of preceding a man in small communities, and they treated him with a mixture of respect and wariness. The store owner, Mrs. Caldwell, always asked after his health with genuine concern, but Fletcher could see the questions in her eyes that she was too polite to voice. How long could a man live alone with his ghosts? When would solitude curdle into something darker? Fletcher wondered about that himself sometimes, especially during the long winter months when snow made travel impossible and the world contracted to the space between his cabin walls. He'd catch himself staring at the wooden faces on his mantel for long minutes, almost believing he could hear Margaret's voice calling from the kitchen, Samuel's excited chatter about some small adventure. Those moments scared him more than any grizzly or mountain lion ever could. They whispered of a mind beginning to fray at the edges, of a man who might be losing his grip on the boundary between memory and reality. But spring always returned, bringing with it the busy work of planting and the renewal that came with longer days and warming earth. This particular morning felt different somehow, charged with a restless energy that Fletcher couldn't quite name. He'd slept poorly, woken by dreams he couldn't quite remember, but that left him with a sense of anticipation mixed with unease. The goats had been skittish during the morning milking. Their ears pricked toward the deep forest, as if listening to sounds beyond human perception. Fletcher finished his coffee and set the cup on the porch railing. He needed to check his snare lines today. The rabbit population seemed to be recovering after a harsh winter, and fresh meat would be welcome. As he gathered his rifle and game bag, he paused again at the mantel, his fingers tracing the carved outline of Catherine's small face. She would have been walking by now, probably getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of a 2-year-old. Samuel would be 7, old enough to help with simple chores, to learn the names of birds and trees. Fletcher shook his head, pushing away the familiar ache of what might have been. The dead were gone, and the living had to find ways to keep moving forward. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, but he'd learned it well. Today was another day to be grateful for, another morning in the mountains that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. He stepped off the porch and into the cool morning air, his boots crunching softly on the carpet of pine needles. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast tapestry of green and shadow that had been here long before he arrived and would remain long after he was gone. In that continuity, Fletcher had found a measure of peace. Perhaps it was enough. Perhaps a man didn't need more than a roof over his head, food in his belly, and the quiet companionship of the wilderness as he walked toward the tree line. Fletcher had no way of knowing that this particular morning would shatter his carefully constructed solitude forever. The mountains held many secrets, and he was about to stumble upon one that would change everything he thought he knew about the world and about himself. The cry reached Fletcher when he was 2 miles from his cabin, checking the 4th snare in his line. At first, he thought it might be a young deer caught in brambles, or perhaps a bear cub separated from its mother. But as he paused to listen, something about the sound made the hair on his neck stand up. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful, too much like a human infant's distressed wailing. Fletcher had been moving through the forest with the quiet efficiency of long practice, his weathered hands checking each snare with automatic precision. The morning had yielded 2 fat rabbits and a grouse, enough to keep his stew pot full for several days. But this sound cut through his practical concerns like a knife through canvas. No human settlement lay within 30 miles of this spot, and no traveler with sense would attempt the treacherous mountain passes with a baby in tow. The crying came again, closer now, floating through the pine boughs with heartbreaking clarity. Fletcher found himself moving toward the sound before conscious thought could intervene. His cavalry training had taught him caution in unknown situations, but something deeper than military discipline was driving him forward. The sound triggered memories he tried to keep buried, nights when Samuel had fought fevers, when baby Catherine had cried inconsolably through long, dark hours. He crested a small ridge and looked down into a sheltered hollow where a mountain spring fed a circle of emerald grass. What he saw there made him stop dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. A small figure lay beside the spring, no larger than a year-old child, but covered from head to toe in thick, coarse hair the color of pine bark. The creature, for Fletcher's mind could find no other word, wore no clothes yet seemed well protected against the mountain cold by its natural coat. It was crying with the unmistakable desperation of an abandoned infant, its small arms reaching toward the sky as if calling for help that would never come. Fletcher's first instinct was to back away slowly, to pretend he'd never seen this impossible thing. His rational mind catalogued the impossibilities, the creature's size and apparent age, its strange appearance, the fact that it was alone in the wilderness, yet somehow still alive. But as he watched, the small being turned its head toward him, and Fletcher found himself staring into eyes that were unmistakably, undeniably human. They were large and dark, filled with intelligence and desperate need, framed by features that were almost human, despite the creature's unusual covering. Those eyes undid him completely. In them, Fletcher saw his own children's faces during their final illness, the way they'd looked at him with perfect trust, even as fever consumed them. He saw helplessness and hope intermingled, the universal appeal of the young for protection and care. Before he could think better of it, Fletcher was moving down the slope toward the spring. The creature didn't flee as he approached. Instead, its crying intensified, small arms reaching toward him with heartbreaking desperation. Up close, Fletcher could see that despite its unusual appearance, this was indeed an infant, probably no more than a year old, with the pudgy limbs and oversized head of human babies. Its hair wasn't quite fur, he realized, but something in between, thick and soft and surprisingly clean. The child, for Fletcher found himself thinking of it as a child, had clearly been cared for recently. Someone or something had been looking after this little one. Fletcher knelt beside the creature, his rough hands hovering uncertainly above its small form. The moment his fingers made contact with the child's forehead, the crying stopped. Large, dark eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that was almost unnerving. The child made soft, cooing sounds and reached up to touch Fletcher's bearded cheek with tiny fingers that felt completely human despite their unusual covering. "Where did you come from, little one?" Fletcher murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. The child seemed to understand the gentle tone, if not the words, settling into his arms with a trust that pierced Fletcher's carefully guarded heart. The small body was warm and solid, with the sweet scent of healthy infant mixed with something wilder. Pine sap and mountain air, and something else Fletcher couldn't identify. As he held the child, Fletcher began to notice other details that deepened the mystery. Small footprints in the soft earth around the spring, but not quite human in shape. broader, with longer toes that seemed almost designed for gripping. The tracks were tiny, but perfectly formed, as if the child had been walking far longer than any human infant could manage. Scattered around the area were broken branches and disturbed vegetation that suggested something large had been here recently, moving through the forest with considerable force. Fletcher's mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Could this be some unknown species, something science had yet to catalogue? The mountains were vast and largely unexplored, home to creatures that existed more in legend than fact. He'd heard stories from the local tribes about forest giants, beings that walked upright like men but towered above the tallest trees. Old hunters sometimes spoke of glimpses caught at twilight, massive figures moving through the deep woods with surprising grace. But those were just stories, weren't they? The child in his arms made a soft sound of contentment, small fingers clutching at his shirt. Whatever its origins, this was a living being in need of care. Fletcher had formula milk from his goats back at the cabin, warm blankets, shelter from the mountain cold that would surely claim such a small life by nightfall. His practical nature warred with caution, but the battle was brief. He couldn't leave a helpless infant to die, regardless of what species it might belong to. As Fletcher stood, with the child cradled against his chest, he became aware of being watched. It was an old sensation from his cavalry days, the prickling awareness that hostile eyes were tracking his movements. He scanned the tree line carefully but saw nothing except the play of shadow and sunlight through the pine boughs. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger as he began the journey back to his cabin. The child seemed to sense something as well, its small head turning to peer over Fletcher's shoulder at the forest behind them. Instead of fear, however, the little one showed what appeared to be recognition, making soft sounds that might have been attempts at communication. Several times during the trek home, Fletcher paused to listen, certain he'd heard large bodies moving through the underbrush parallel to his path. But each time he stopped, the forest fell silent, except for the normal sounds of wind and birdsong. By the time Fletcher reached his cabin, the morning mist had burned off, and the sun was climbing toward its zenith. The child had dozed fitfully during the journey, occasionally stirring to look around with those remarkably intelligent eyes. Fletcher found himself talking softly as he walked, the same soothing nonsense he'd once used with his own children. The words seemed to comfort both the strange infant and something deep in Fletcher's own wounded heart. Once inside the cabin, Fletcher faced the practical challenges of caring for his unexpected guest. He warmed goat's milk in a pan, testing the temperature against his wrist the way Margaret had taught him years ago. The child drank eagerly from a makeshift bottle fashioned from a clean cloth, its small hands gripping Fletcher's fingers with surprising strength. After feeding, Fletcher fashioned a bed from soft blankets near the fireplace, watching in amazement as the child settled immediately into deep, peaceful sleep. As evening approached, and Fletcher went about his usual routines of tending the goats and securing his property for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world had shifted on its axis. The child's presence filled the cabin with a warmth he hadn't felt since his family's death, but it also brought questions that had no easy answers. Where had this creature come from? Who or what had been caring for it? And most unsettling of all, what would happen when those responsible came looking for their missing young? Fletcher stood on his porch as darkness settled over the mountains, listening to the night sounds of the forest with new awareness. Somewhere out there, something was searching. He could feel it as surely as he could feel the approaching storm that would bring snow before morning. Tomorrow would bring answers, he was certain. Whether those answers would bring peace or conflict remained to be seen. Fletcher woke before dawn to the sound of the child stirring near the fireplace, making soft cooing noises that tugged at his heart. The little one had slept peacefully through the night, occasionally shifting in the nest of blankets Fletcher had arranged. Now, in the grey light filtering through the cabin's single window, Fletcher could see those remarkable dark eyes tracking his movements with an intelligence that seemed far beyond the child's apparent age. "Good morning." "Little one," Fletcher said softly, his voice still rough with sleep. The child responded with what sounded almost like an attempt at mimicking his greeting, the small mouth-forming shapes that weren't quite words, but weren't random sounds either. Fletcher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain morning. Human infants didn't develop speech patterns this quickly, didn't show such focused awareness of their surroundings. He prepared another bottle of warm goat's milk, marveling at how the child seemed to anticipate his movements. When Fletcher approached with the makeshift bottle, small arms reached up immediately, and the feeding proceeded with an efficiency that spoke of remarkable adaptability. The child's grip on his fingers was stronger than any human infant could manage, yet gentle and careful, as if the little one understood its own unusual strength. After the feeding, Fletcher carried the child outside to tend his morning chores. The goats gathered around with unusual interest, their typical wariness replaced by what Fletcher could only describe as reverence. His old nanny goat, usually protective of her milk and suspicious of strangers, nuzzled the child's small hand with surprising gentleness. Even more startling, the child seemed to communicate with the animals through soft sounds and gestures, causing the entire herd to settle into unusual calm. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Fletcher murmured, watching this impossible interaction. The child looked up at him with those penetrating eyes and made a sound that Fletcher could have sworn was laughter. It was while returning from the goat pen that Fletcher first noticed the stones. Arranged in a rough circle around his cabin were weathered granite markers, each about the size of a man's head, placed with obvious intention, yet somehow ancient-looking. Fletcher had lived on this property for 3 years and walked this ground countless times. These stones had not been here yesterday. He set the child down carefully on the porch and approached the nearest marker. The stone was covered in a thin layer of moss and lichen that suggested great age, yet it had clearly been moved recently. Fresh scratches in the earth showed where it had been dragged into position. Running his fingers over the surface, Fletcher felt faint indentations that might have been carved symbols, worn almost smooth by countless seasons of weather. The child made an urgent sound from the porch, and Fletcher looked back to see small arms pointing toward the forest. Following the child's gaze, Fletcher spotted more stones deeper in the trees, forming what appeared to be a much larger pattern extending far beyond his small clearing. The arrangement wasn't random. Even from his limited vantage point, Fletcher could sense an underlying geometry, a purpose that spoke of intelligence and planning. "What is this place?" Fletcher whispered, more to himself than to the child. But the little one responded with a series of soft sounds that carried an unmistakable note of recognition, as if these stones were familiar landmarks from home. Throughout the morning, Fletcher found himself divided between caring for his unexpected guest and investigating the mysterious markers. The child seemed content to observe from the cabin's porch, occasionally pointing towards specific stones and making sounds that Fletcher began to interpret as a form of commentary. It was as if the little one was trying to explain something important but lacked the words to make Fletcher understand. The forest around the cabin felt different too. Fletcher's experienced woodsman's senses detected subtle changes. The way bird songs carried differently through the trees, the absence of small game in areas where rabbits and squirrels usually foraged, the feeling of vast presences moving just beyond the range of sight. Several times he caught glimpses of large shadows shifting between the pines, but whenever he focused his attention on a specific spot, he found only normal forest. By midday, the child had begun to show signs of restlessness that Fletcher recognized from his own children's behavior. The little one crawled with remarkable speed and agility, exploring the cabin's interior with fearless curiosity. When Fletcher tried to contain this exploration, the child demonstrated a problem-solving ability that was genuinely unsettling. Blocked from one route, the little one would immediately find another, showing a spatial reasoning that far exceeded normal infant development. "You're not really a baby, are you?" Fletcher said during one of these incidents, watching the child navigate around obstacles with strategic thinking. Not the way we understand babies, anyway. The child paused in its exploration and fixed Fletcher with a stare so direct, and knowing that Fletcher felt his breath catch. For a moment, it seemed as if the little one was about to speak, to reveal some crucial truth. Instead, the child simply reached up with both arms, asking to be held with the universal gesture of infants everywhere. Fletcher lifted the child, feeling the solid warmth of the small body against his chest. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, it was still young and dependent and in need of care. The growing bond Fletcher felt was stronger than logic or caution. This child had awakened something in him that had been dormant since his family's death, the protective instinct of a father, the deep satisfaction of being needed. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Fletcher became increasingly aware that they were no longer alone. The sensation of being watched had grown stronger throughout the day, and now he could detect the subtle signs of large bodies moving through the forest. Branches bent in patterns that Wind couldn't explain. The distant sound of footsteps too heavy for any known mountain wildlife, and once, the unmistakable glimpse of a massive figure moving between distant trees. The child sensed it too, becoming more alert and responsive to sounds from the forest. Instead of fear, however, the little one showed obvious excitement, making happy sounds and reaching toward the tree line as if greeting old friends. Fletcher realized with growing certainty that the child's family was approaching, and that the mysterious arrival he'd sensed last night was about to become reality. As evening approached, Fletcher found himself faced with questions that had no precedent in his experience. How did one prepare for contact with beings that existed outside human understanding? What protocols governed such encounters? His military training provided no guidance for this situation, and his instincts were torn between protective caution and growing curiosity about the remarkable family that had produced this extraordinary child. The stone markers seemed to pulse with invisible energy as darkness gathered, and Fletcher had the distinct impression that they were more than simple boundary markers. They were a message, perhaps, or a form of communication he couldn't yet understand. The child's excited babbling suggested that significant events were imminent, and Fletcher realized that his life of careful solitude was about to be transformed in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Standing on his porch with the child in his arms, Fletcher watched the shadows deepen between the pines and prepared himself for whatever the night might bring. The mountains held ancient secrets, and he was about to become part of a story far older and more complex than his simple hermit's existence. Dawn broke with unnatural stillness, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Fletcher had dozed fitfully through the night in his chair by the fireplace, the child sleeping peacefully in his arms. Every small sound from outside had brought him instantly alert, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle, leaning against the wall. But when morning finally arrived, it came with a silence so profound that even the usual bird songs were absent. Fletcher rose carefully, trying not to wake the child, and moved to the cabin's single window. What he saw there made his blood run cold and filled him with wonder in equal measure. The mist that typically clung to the valley floor had formed into perfect towering columns around his cabin, creating natural barriers that seemed both beautiful and deliberately placed. Through these curtains of vapor, massive shapes moved with surprising grace, circling his small homestead like silent guardians. The child stirred in his arms, small eyes opening to focus immediately on the window. Instead of fear, the little one's face lit up with unmistakable joy, small hands clapping together in excitement. Fletcher realized he was witnessing a reunion, and his role in it was about to be defined by whatever happened in the next few minutes. A shadow fell across the cabin door, followed by a sound Fletcher would remember for the rest of his life, a deep, resonant call that seemed to come from the earth itself. It wasn't threatening, but it carried an authority that made Fletcher's bones vibrate in sympathy. The child responded immediately with excited babbling, struggling to free itself from Fletcher's protective embrace. Fletcher moved to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the heavy wooden barrier, he could sense an enormous presence waiting with infinite patience. Taking a deep breath, he lifted the bar and slowly pulled the door open. The creature standing on his porch was unlike anything Fletcher had ever imagined. Nearly 8 feet tall, covered in thick dark hair that seemed to absorb the morning light, it stood with a dignity that was unmistakably intelligent and peaceful. But it was the eyes that captured Fletcher's attention. Ancient, wise, and filled with an emotion Fletcher recognized as parental concern. In one massive hand, the creature carried a staff carved from what appeared to be a single piece of mountain oak, its surface covered in intricate patterns that hurt Fletcher's eyes to look at directly. The child in Fletcher's arms erupted into delighted sounds, reaching toward the towering figure with obvious recognition. The creature, clearly female, Fletcher realized despite her imposing size, responded with sounds so gentle and musical that Fletcher felt tears prick his eyes. This was a mother greeting her lost child, and the relief and joy in that exchange transcended all barriers of species or understanding. Fletcher found himself stepping forward, offering the child to its rightful family. The massive being's eyes met his, and in that moment, Fletcher experienced something that would change him forever. Through that gaze, he felt a communication that bypassed language entirely, gratitude so profound it left him breathless, recognition of his kindness, and something that might have been an invitation to understanding, the creature's enormous hand, easily large enough to crush Fletcher's skull, reached out with infinite gentleness to touch his face. Her fingers were surprisingly warm, calloused from hard living but tender in their contact. Fletcher felt no fear, only a deep sense of rightness, as if this meeting had been ordained by forces beyond his comprehension. Around the cabin, other figures emerged from the mist. An entire family group, Fletcher realized. Adults and juveniles of various sizes, all moving with the same quiet dignity as their apparent leader. None showed aggression or territorial behavior. Instead, they arranged themselves in a loose circle, their posture respectful, almost reverent. Fletcher counted at least a dozen individuals, their dark forms substantial yet somehow harmonious with the natural landscape. The child's mother, for Fletcher had no doubt that's who she was, carefully took her offspring from Fletcher's arms. The reunion was heartbreaking in its tenderness, the massive being cradling the small form with a delicacy that spoke of infinite love and care. The child nestled immediately against its mother's chest, small hands grasping at the thick hair, tiny face turning to look back at Fletcher with what he could only interpret as affection. Fletcher realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in human history. Peaceful contact with beings that existed parallel to humanity but separate from it. These creatures possessed intelligence, family structures, and emotional depth that rivaled his own species. The staff carried by the matriarch wasn't just a walking stick, it was a symbol of authority, marking her as a leader among her people. The elder creature approached Fletcher again, this time extending the staff toward him. Not offering it, Fletcher understood, but showing it to him. The carved surface seemed to shift and change as he watched, patterns resolving into what might have been a form of writing or symbolic communication. The message was beyond his ability to interpret, but the intent seemed clear. This was an introduction, a formal presentation of credentials between leaders of different peoples. Fletcher nodded slowly, understanding that some form of protocol was being observed. He stepped back and gestured toward his cabin, then toward the surrounding forest, trying to communicate that these beings were welcome in this place. The matriarch's response was a sound that Fletcher felt more than heard, a deep harmonic that seemed to express acceptance and gratitude. The other members of the group began to move with more confidence, no longer holding themselves at the edges of the clearing. Fletcher watched in amazement as they explored his property with obvious curiosity but careful respect for his belongings. A younger adult examined his woodpile with professional interest, running massive fingers over his axework with what appeared to be approval. Another investigated his garden, bending carefully to examine the vegetables with the air of one gardener appreciating another's work. The child's reunion with its family was clearly a joyous occasion, but Fletcher noticed that the little one kept looking back toward him, making sounds that seemed to be explanations or introductions. He had the distinct impression that the child was telling its family about the strange human who had provided care and comfort during a frightening time alone. As the morning progressed, Fletcher found himself relaxing into this impossible situation. These beings, whatever they were, posed no threat to him. If anything, they seemed grateful for his intervention on behalf of their young. The matriarch remained close, her presence both protective and inclusive. As if Fletcher had been accepted into some extended definition of family, the ancient stone markers around his cabin took on new meaning as Fletcher watched the creatures move among them with obvious familiarity. This wasn't just his homestead. It was apparently a place of significance to these beings, marked and honored by generations of their kind. He had built his sanctuary unknowingly within the boundaries of something much older and more sacred than he had ever imagined. The matriarch's attempts at communication began in earnest as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning mist. She approached Fletcher with careful deliberation, reaching into what appeared to be a woven pouch at her side. From this container she withdrew several smooth river stones, each one polished to a lustrous finish and carved with intricate symbols that seemed to flow across. Their surfaces like living script, Fletcher watched in fascination as she arranged the stones on his porch in deliberate patterns, her massive fingers moving with surprising delicacy. Each placement seemed significant, part of a larger communication system that Fletcher began to recognize as sophisticated beyond anything he had imagined. The stones weren't random. They formed sequences and relationships that suggested grammar, syntax, even emotional context. The matriarch pointed to the first stone, then to herself, making a sound that was clearly her name or title. The symbol carved into the stone's surface seemed to shift as Fletcher watched, resolving into what might have been a stylized representation of her face, or perhaps her role within the group. She repeated the gesture several times, waiting patiently for Fletcher to understand. "You're telling me who you are," Fletcher said slowly, pointing to the stone and then to her. The matriarch's eyes brightened with unmistakable intelligence, and she nodded, a remarkably human gesture that sent a chill down Fletcher's spine. She understood his words, or at least his intent. The next stone showed a different symbol, and the matriarch pointed to the child now playing contentedly at the edge of the group. The meaning was clear. This stone represented the little one. Fletcher felt a surge of understanding as he began to see the elegant logic of their communication system. Each stone was a word, a concept, a building block of meaning that could be combined to create complex thoughts. Over the course of the morning, the matriarch built an increasingly sophisticated narrative using the translation stones. She showed Fletcher symbols that seemed to represent concepts like lost, storm, search, and gratitude. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and remarkably familiar. A child wandering away during severe weather, parents frantically searching, the desperate hope that their offspring might still be alive. Fletcher found himself drawn into the communication, using gestures and simple drawings in the dirt to respond to her stone messages. When he sketched a rough map showing where he had found the child, the matriarch's relief was palpable. She added stones to the pattern that Fletcher interpreted as expressions of thanks and blessing, her massive hands moving with a reverence that suggested deep spiritual significance. The other members of the group watched these exchanges with obvious interest, occasionally adding their own stone patterns to the growing conversation. Fletcher realized he was witnessing not just communication, but diplomacy, formal first contact between two intelligent species. The weight of that responsibility both thrilled and terrified him, As the matriarch continued her narrative, Fletcher began to understand that his finding the child hadn't been purely accidental. The storm she described had been particularly severe, driving their group from their usual territory into areas they rarely visited. The child's disappearance had occurred near the boundary of what they considered safe travel, in regions where humans sometimes ventured. The family had been searching for days, following increasingly cold trails, when they detected Fletcher's scent mixed with their child's. The translation stones revealed a society more complex than Fletcher had dared imagine. There were symbols for different family relationships, for seasonal territories, for the roles individuals played within the group's social structure. The matriarch herself was clearly a leader, but not in the way Fletcher understood human leadership. Her authority seemed to come from wisdom and experience rather than dominance, and her decision-making appeared to involve consultation with other group members. Fletcher was particularly struck by symbols that seemed to represent concepts of stewardship and protection. These beings saw themselves as guardians of the forest, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance that kept the ecosystem healthy. They moved through the mountains with purpose, following ancient patterns that ensured no area was overhunted or damaged by their presence. The stone markers around Fletcher's cabin weren't just territorial boundaries, they were part of a vast network that these creatures used to coordinate their movements across hundreds of square miles. The most profound revelation came when the matriarch arranged stones that clearly referred to humans. The symbols weren't negative, but they carried undertones of sadness and loss. Through careful questioning and gesture, Fletcher learned that these beings had once lived in closer proximity to human settlements. But as towns grew larger and hunters became more aggressive, his kind had retreated deeper into the wilderness, avoiding contact whenever possible. The matriarch's stone patterns spoke of violence and misunderstanding, of their people being hunted for sport or killed out of fear. Fletcher felt a deep shame as he understood that humanity's expansion had driven these intelligent beings to the very edges of survival. They had become myths and legends precisely because they had been forced to hide from the species that claimed dominion over the land. Yet there was no anger in the matriarch's communication, only a profound sadness and a cautious hope. Fletcher's kindness to their child had shown them that not all humans were threats. His isolated existence and respectful treatment of the forest had marked him as potentially different from others of his kind. The translation stones suggested that his cabin's location within their sacred territory hadn't been coincidence. They had been watching him for months, studying his behavior, trying to determine if he could be trusted. Fletcher found himself profoundly moved by this revelation. His hermit's existence, which he had seen as escape from human society, had apparently been an extended audition for acceptance by a far older and wiser people. Every kindness to the forest, every careful hunting practice, every respectful treatment of the land had been observed and evaluated by beings whose survival depended on accurately judging human character. The matriarch's final stone pattern of the morning was the most complex yet, involving dozens of carefully placed stones that seemed to represent multiple concepts simultaneously. Fletcher studied the arrangement, understanding that this was an important message, perhaps the most important one she would share. The symbols seemed to speak of invitation, of possibility, of a future where the barriers between their peoples might be carefully lowered. As the afternoon approached and the group began to show signs of preparing to move on, Fletcher realized he was being offered something unprecedented, the chance to serve as a bridge between two worlds that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding for generations. The responsibility was staggering, but so was the opportunity to help heal wounds that had festered for far too long. The afternoon brought an even more profound revelation when the matriarch approached Fletcher with something he had never seen before, a piece of fabric that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The cloth was roughly the size of a blanket, woven from fibers Fletcher couldn't identify, with patterns that appeared to move and change as he watched. The matriarch handled it with obvious reverence, unfolding it carefully on the cleared ground beside his cabin. Fletcher understood immediately that he was being shown something sacred, something that wasn't shared lightly with outsiders. The other members of the group gathered in a respectful circle as the matriarch began to manipulate the fabric in ways that defied Fletcher's understanding of how cloth should behave. Her massive fingers traced specific patterns across its surface, and images began to appear, not painted or woven, but somehow projected from within the material itself. What Fletcher saw there made him question everything he thought he knew about history and the world around him. The memory cloth, as he came to think of it, showed him scenes from the past that played out like moving pictures. He watched in awe as images formed and dissolved, telling a story that stretched back generations, perhaps centuries. The first visions showed these beings living in greater numbers, their settlements scattered throughout mountain ranges that Fletcher recognized as spanning multiple territories. They weren't primitive creatures hiding in caves, but a sophisticated people with their own architecture, their own technologies, their own rich culture. Their homes were marvels of engineering that blended seamlessly with the natural landscape, built into cliffsides and forest clearings in ways that enhanced rather than dominated the environment. Fletcher saw families like the one before him, but in much larger communities. Children played in carefully tended gardens, while adults worked at crafts that required remarkable skill and intelligence. The memory cloth showed him their knowledge of plants and minerals, their ability to weave materials that could hold light and memory, their sophisticated understanding of the natural world that put human science to shame. But as the images progressed, Fletcher began to see the encroachment of his own species. Human settlements appeared in the visions, at first small and respectful of boundaries. The early contact between the peoples seemed peaceful, even cooperative. Fletcher watched scenes of trade and mutual assistance, humans and the forest people working together to survive in the harsh mountain environment. The change came gradually, then with terrible swiftness. As human settlements grew larger and more numerous, conflicts arose over territory and resources. Fletcher saw battles that made his stomach clench with horror, not because the forest people were violent, but because they were so clearly unprepared for human aggression. Their peaceful nature, their reluctance to harm other intelligent beings, made them vulnerable to a species that had learned to solve problems through force. The memory cloth showed him hunting parties that tracked the forest people not for food or protection, but for sport. Wealthy men from distant cities paying guides to lead them to creatures they could kill for trophies. Government officials who declared the beings dangerous simply because they were different, ordering military expeditions to clear territories that had been home to the forest people for countless generations. Fletcher watched in anguish as families like the one surrounding him were torn apart, their children killed or captured, their elders murdered for the crime of existing outside human understanding. He saw the great communities abandoned, the survivors fleeing deeper into wilderness areas that humans considered too harsh for settlement. The memory cloth revealed a systematic destruction of an entire civilization, justified by fear and greed and the simple human inability to accept the existence of other intelligent species. The most heartbreaking images showed the forest people's attempts to hide, to become invisible to human perception. Fletcher watched as they developed techniques for moving through their ancestral territories without leaving traces, for communicating across vast distances without making sounds that human ears could detect. They became the shadows and legends that occasionally frightened late-night travelers, but only because remaining mythical was their only hope for survival. The matriarch's manipulation of the memory cloth brought the story closer to the present, showing Fletcher scenes he found almost unbearable to witness. Families reduced to single digits, hiding in the most remote corners of wilderness areas. Children growing up without ever seeing others of their kind, isolated groups slowly dying out as they lost contact with the broader community. The vibrant civilization he had seen in the early images had been reduced to scattered survivors, clinging to existence in a world that no longer had room for them. But the most shocking revelation came in the cloth's final sequence of images. Fletcher saw himself, his own arrival in these mountains 3 years ago, his construction of the cabin, his daily routines and interactions with the forest. The forest people had been watching him from the beginning, studying this solitary human who seemed different from the others they had encountered. Fletcher watched his own actions played back through their eyes, his careful hunting practices that took only what he needed, his respectful treatment of the land, his obvious grief and isolation that marked him as separate from the aggressive expansion of human civilization. He saw himself through their perception as a broken creature seeking healing in solitude, someone who might understand loss and displacement because he had experienced it himself. The memory cloth showed him the debates among the forest people about whether to trust him, the careful observations that had led to their decision to mark his territory with the ancient stones. He realized that his acceptance of their sacred boundaries, his unconscious respect for the patterns they had established, had been the final test of his character. As the images faded and the matriarch carefully folded the memory cloth, Fletcher understood that he had been given an extraordinary gift, not just the knowledge of their history, but their trust. By sharing their most sacred artifact with him, they had made him a keeper of their story, a witness to their struggle for survival. The weight of that responsibility settled on Fletcher's shoulders like a heavy blanket. These beings represented something irreplaceable, a form of intelligence and wisdom that had evolved alongside humanity but remained fundamentally different. Their loss would impoverish the world in ways that most humans would never understand, but there was hope in their willingness to share this history with him. Fletcher realized that he was being invited to help write the next chapter of their story, to serve as a bridge between two species that had been separated by centuries of misunderstanding and conflict. The child he had rescued had become the catalyst for something far larger than he had ever imagined, the possibility of healing wounds that had festered for generations. The peaceful afternoon was shattered when one of the younger members of the group came crashing through the underbrush, his massive form moving with urgent desperation. In his hands, he carried something that made Fletcher's blood run cold, a carved wooden figure about the size of a man's fist. Its surface blackened as if by fire, its features twisted into an expression of warning and fear. The matriarch took the warning totem with hands that trembled slightly, her ancient eyes scanning its surface with growing alarm. The carved symbols seemed to shift and writhe as Fletcher watched, telling a story that needed no translation. Danger was approaching, and it was moving fast. The entire group erupted into silent, efficient activity. Fletcher had seen similar reactions during his cavalry days when enemy forces were spotted on the horizon. But this was different, more coordinated, more desperate. These beings were preparing not for battle, but for flight, and their urgency suggested that whatever was coming left them no other choice. The matriarch approached Fletcher with the warning totem, pointing to specific symbols while making sounds that carried unmistakable notes of distress. Through gestures and the few translation stones she could quickly arrange, she painted a picture that made Fletcher's heart sink. A group of humans was moving through the forest, but these weren't lost travelers or casual hunters. The symbols suggested organization, purpose, and numbers that far exceeded any normal expedition. Fletcher's military experience allowed him to read between the lines of the matriarch's hurried communication. This was a hunting party specifically organized to track and capture the forest people. The warning, totem's burned surface, told him that other groups like this one had already been discovered, their sacred markers destroyed, their members killed or scattered to the winds. The child, the innocent catalyst for this peaceful contact, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation despite its young age. It clung to its mother with obvious distress, making soft sounds that broke Fletcher's heart. This reunion, which should have been a joyous occasion, was about to become another tragedy in the long history of persecution that the memory cloth had revealed. Fletcher found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could step back, claim ignorance if questioned by the approaching humans, and return to his carefully constructed solitude. The forest people would disappear back into the wilderness, taking their secrets and their trust with them. His life would continue as it had before, empty but safe, or he could stand with beings who had shown him more wisdom and compassion in a single day than he had experienced in years of human interaction. The choice should have been difficult, but Fletcher discovered that it wasn't difficult at all. These creatures had trusted him with their most sacred secrets, had welcomed him into their extended family, had shown him possibilities for connection that he had thought lost forever. How many? Fletcher asked the matriarch, holding up fingers to indicate numbers. Her response, communicated through quick stone arrangements and gestures, suggested at least a dozen humans, possibly more. They were armed with rifles and organized like a military expedition. Worse, they carried equipment that suggested they intended to capture rather than simply kill. Nets, restraints, devices that spoke of scientific interest rather than mere sport hunting. Fletcher's mind raced through the tactical implications. His cabin's location, while isolated, was accessible by the same trails that the hunting party would likely use. The ancient stone markers that made this place sacred to the forest people would also make it an obvious target for anyone tracking their movements. His peaceful sanctuary was about to become a battleground, and he was vastly outnumbered, but Fletcher had advantages that the approaching hunters couldn't know about. He knew this terrain intimately, understood the weather patterns that could work for or against various strategic options, and most importantly, he had allies who possessed knowledge of the wilderness that far exceeded his own considerable skills. The forest people might avoid direct confrontation, but that didn't mean they were helpless. The matriarch seemed to read his thoughts, her ancient eyes studying his face with an intensity that made Fletcher feel transparent. When she spoke, using a combination of sounds and translation stones, her message was clear. They didn't expect him to fight their battles, but they would welcome his help in avoiding one. Their goal wasn't victory, but survival, not conquest, but the chance to disappear once again into the vast wilderness that had sheltered them for so long. Fletcher nodded his understanding, then surprised the entire group by disappearing into his cabin and emerging with items that transformed him from hermit to soldier. His old cavalry saber still sharp and well-maintained, despite years of disuse. His military-issue field glasses, essential for reconnaissance in mountain terrain. Most importantly, the detailed topographical maps he had studied obsessively during his 3 years in these mountains. Maps that showed every trail, every defensible position, every route of escape that the approaching danger might not anticipate. The forest people watched in fascination as Fletcher spread his maps on the cabin's porch, his weathered fingers tracing routes and calculating distances with the precision of long military experience. He showed them positions where small groups could observe approaching threats without being detected, identified choke points where a few individuals could delay much larger forces, and marked escape routes that would take advantage of terrain features that humans would find difficult to navigate. The matriarch's response to his tactical knowledge was immediate and profound. Through quick stone arrangements, she indicated that they had hoped for his understanding, but had never dared expect his active assistance. Fletcher's willingness to use his military expertise on their behalf represented a complete reversal of their historical experience with organized human forces. As they planned their response to the approaching threat, Fletcher found himself thinking about the child who had brought them all together. This innocent being, whose only crime was becoming lost during a storm, had inadvertently triggered events that could determine the survival of an entire species. The irony wasn't lost on Fletcher. In trying to save one lost child, He might be helping to preserve the last remnants of a civilization that had been systematically destroyed by his own kind. The warning totem's presence changed everything about their careful first contact. What should have been the beginning of a new understanding between species had become a race against time, a desperate attempt to prevent another chapter of tragedy in the forest people's long history of persecution. Fletcher realized that his choice to stand with them wasn't just about loyalty or gratitude. It was about the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave in a world that had already taken too much from him. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks and the shadows grew longer around his cabin, Fletcher prepared for what might be his final battle. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting for abstract concepts like duty or country. He would be fighting for family, a family he had never expected to find, a family that had welcomed him despite every reason to fear and distrust his kind. The warning totem sat on his porch like a silent accusation, its burned surface reflecting the dying light. Soon the hunters would arrive, and Fletcher would discover whether his newfound family could survive another encounter with the species that had driven them to the very edge of extinction. Fletcher's transformation from mountain hermit to tactical commander happened with a speed that surprised even him. Years of solitary living had dulled many of his military instincts, but the approaching threat awakened skills that had been honed during countless cavalry campaigns. As evening shadows lengthened across his property, he found himself studying terrain with the cold calculation of a professional soldier preparing for asymmetric warfare. His military maps, yellowed with age but still remarkably detailed, became the foundation for their defense strategy. Fletcher spread the largest chart across his kitchen table while the matriarch and several other forest people gathered around, their massive forms somehow managing to study the intricate topographical details without overwhelming the small space. The maps showed every elevation change, every water source, every potential choke point within a 20-mile radius of his cabin. "Here," Fletcher said, pointing to a narrow valley that funneled into his property from the south. "If they're tracking your people's movements, this is the most likely approach route. The terrain forces them into a single file formation, and there are at least 3 positions where we could observe their progress without being detected." The matriarch studied the map with an intelligence that Fletcher found both humbling and inspiring. Her massive finger traced alternative routes with the precision of someone who had spent decades moving through this landscape. Through translation stones and careful gestures, she showed Fletcher pathways that didn't appear on any human map, game trails that wound through seemingly impassable terrain, hidden caves that could shelter small groups, and observation points that commanded views of multiple valleys simultaneously. Fletcher realized he was witnessing the difference between human knowledge of the land and the forest people's integration with it. His maps were accurate but incomplete, showing only what human surveyors had been able to measure and record. The matriarch's knowledge went deeper, encompassing generations of accumulated wisdom about how the mountains behaved in different seasons, how weather patterns affected travel routes, and where the land itself provided natural advantages to those who understood its rhythms. Working together, they developed a plan that played to both their strengths. Fletcher's military experience provided the tactical framework, how to establish observation posts, how to coordinate movements between multiple groups, how to use terrain features to multiply force effectiveness. The forest people's intimate knowledge of the landscape provided the practical details that would make those tactics work, which routes could be traveled silently, where natural barriers could be enhanced with minimal effort, and how to use the forest itself as both shield and weapon. The child, despite its young age, seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. It stayed close to its mother, but watched Fletcher's planning with obvious interest, occasionally making soft sounds that the other forest people treated as meaningful contributions to their discussion. Fletcher found himself wondering about the intelligence levels these beings achieved as adults. if their young could already grasp complex strategic concepts. As darkness settled over the mountains, Fletcher began implementing their plans. His first priority was establishing early warning systems that would give them maximum time to react to the approaching threat. He positioned 3 of the younger adult forest people at key observation points, teaching them simple light signals that could communicate basic information across distances without making sound. Their natural ability to move silently through the forest made them ideal scouts, and their night vision far exceeded human capabilities. The matriarch remained at Fletcher's cabin with the child and 2 other adults, ready to coordinate the response once the threat was confirmed. Fletcher's role was to serve as the primary interface with the approaching humans. His presence might confuse their tracking, and his knowledge of human tactics could provide crucial insights into their opponent's likely behavior. Fletcher's biggest concern was the hunter's motivation and organization level. The warning totem's burned surface suggested they weren't simple trophy hunters or curious researchers. The systematic approach implied either government involvement or the kind of private expedition that came with serious financial backing. Either possibility meant they would be well-equipped, professionally guided, and committed to achieving their objectives regardless of obstacles. As the night deepened, Fletcher found himself remembering similar situations from his cavalry days, waiting for enemy forces to arrive while trying to calculate their strengths and intentions based on incomplete information. But this felt different, more personal. He wasn't fighting for abstract military objectives or territorial control. He was protecting beings who had shown him more trust and acceptance in a single day than he had experienced in years of human contact. The forest people's preparations revealed aspects of their culture that amazed Fletcher. Despite their peaceful nature, they possessed sophisticated understanding of defensive tactics developed over generations of avoiding human persecution. They could set traps that would delay pursuers without causing serious injury, create false trails that would lead hunters away from their actual positions, and coordinate group movements across vast distances using communication methods that human ears couldn't detect. Fletcher watched the matriarch work with materials from her travel pack, creating what appeared to be a complex network of early warning devices. Thin fibers that would vibrate when disturbed, carefully placed stones that would shift if stepped on, and arrangements of pine needles that would show clear evidence of human passage. Her defensive preparations were works of art that blended seamlessly with the natural environment while providing detailed information about anyone approaching their position. The most impressive aspect of their preparations was how little they disturbed the forest itself. Fletcher's military training had emphasized speed and efficiency over environmental concerns, but the forest people achieved both objectives while leaving virtually no trace of their activities. They worked with the landscape rather than against it, enhancing natural features instead of imposing artificial structures. As midnight approached, Fletcher found himself thinking about the child who had started this entire sequence of events. The little one slept peacefully in its mother's arms, unaware that its rescue had triggered a confrontation that could determine the fate of the forest people's remaining families. Fletcher wondered how many other children like this one existed in hidden communities, scattered throughout the wilderness, growing up in a world that offered them no place to belong. The matriarch approached Fletcher as he stood watch on his porch, carrying something he hadn't seen before, a collection of his own maps that she had somehow modified. Looking closer, Fletcher realized she had added information to his charts using natural pigments that showed up clearly in moonlight but would be invisible during the day. Her additions transformed his military maps into comprehensive guides to the forest people's defensive network. Through translation stones, the matriarch explained that she was entrusting Fletcher with knowledge that represented generations of accumulated survival wisdom. If something happened to her group during the coming confrontation, Fletcher would carry the information needed to warn other forest people about this new threat. He was being made a guardian of their survival secrets, a responsibility that both honored and terrified him. Fletcher studied the enhanced maps, understanding that he was looking at the complete defensive network that the forest people had developed over decades of avoiding human contact. Hidden refugees, emergency escape routes, supply caches, and communication relay points that spanned hundreds of square miles. The scope of their organization was staggering. What humans perceived as scattered groups of primitive creatures was actually a sophisticated civilization that had learned to survive by becoming invisible. The realization brought home the magnitude of what they were fighting to protect. This wasn't just about one family or even one community. The approaching hunters threatened the entire network of surviving forest people, all the hidden families trying to preserve their culture and their children in a world that had no official place for them. As dawn approached, and Fletcher prepared for what might be his final battle, he found himself thinking about legacy and meaning. His original family was gone, taken by forces he couldn't fight or prevent. But perhaps he had been given a second chance, an opportunity to protect a different kind of family, to stand between innocent beings and the forces that would destroy them simply because they were different. The enhanced maps in his hands represented more than tactical information. They were proof that he had been accepted into something larger than himself, trusted with secrets that could mean the difference between survival and extinction for an entire species. Whatever happened in the coming hours, Fletcher knew that his life had found new purpose in the most unexpected place, in the defense of beings whose existence most humans would never accept or understand. The hunters arrived with the dawn, just as Fletcher's enhanced maps had predicted they would. The sound reached him first, the distant crack of branches under heavy boots, the low murmur of voices trying to maintain stealth but failing against the acute hearing that mountain living had developed in Fletcher over 3 years of solitude. He counted at least 8 distinct voices, possibly more, approaching from the southern valley exactly as his tactical analysis had suggested. Fletcher stood on his porch, coffee cup in hand, projecting the image of a solitary mountain man beginning another ordinary day. The forest people had melted away into the surrounding wilderness with an efficiency that still amazed him. Invisible to human perception, but positioned to observe everything that was about to unfold. The matriarch had taken the child to a secure position 2 valleys away, but not before entrusting Fletcher with the most sacred object in their possession, an ancient horn carved from mountain sheep bone, its surface worn smooth by countless generations of handling. The sacred horn rested against his cabin wall, looking like nothing more than an old frontier artifact to casual observation. But Fletcher understood its true significance. When blown, it would carry a call across the mountains that every forest person within 50 miles would recognize. A summons to unity that hadn't been used in decades, perhaps longer. The matriarch had made it clear that the horn should only be sounded if their survival was truly threatened, if the approaching humans represented the kind of systematic threat that could destroy what remained of their people. The first hunter to emerge from the tree line was exactly what Fletcher had expected, a professional guide, probably local, moving with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains well. Behind him came the clients, and Fletcher's heart sank as he recognized the type immediately. Wealthy men from back east, armed with expensive rifles and equipment that spoke of serious financial backing. These weren't casual trophy hunters or government researchers. They were collectors, the kind of men who paid enormous sums to acquire things that nobody else possessed. "Morning," Fletcher called out, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who wanted no trouble but was prepared for it nonetheless. "You gentlemen are a long way from anywhere. Coffee's hot if you're interested." The guide approached Fletcher's porch with obvious wariness, his experienced eyes scanning the surroundings for signs of anything unusual. "Appreciate the offer, friend, but we're tracking something through these parts. Wondering if you might have seen anything out of the ordinary lately?" Fletcher sipped his coffee thoughtfully, playing for time, while his mind catalogued the tactical situation. "Define ordinary," he said. "Up here, ordinary tends to be a relative concept. One of the clients, a heavy-set man with expensive gear and the pale complexion of someone who rarely left cities, pushed forward impatiently. "We're tracking large humanoid creatures," he said bluntly. "Our guides have found evidence of a significant population in this area. Footprints, territorial markings, evidence of tool use. We're prepared to pay handsomely for information about their location." Fletcher felt his blood run cold. These men weren't just hunting randomly. They had specific knowledge, detailed information that suggested someone had been feeding them intelligence about the forest people's movements. The systematic nature of their approach explained why the warning totem had been burned, why other groups had been discovered and scattered. "Humanoid creatures," Fletcher repeated slowly. "That's quite a claim. You sure you're not tracking bears? Black bears can leave prints that look mighty strange when the ground's soft." The guide's expression hardened. "We know what we're tracking, friend. Question is whether you're going to help us or get in our way." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Fletcher recognized the moment when diplomacy would give way to something darker. These men had invested too much time and money to be deterred by a single mountain hermit, regardless of how inconvenient his presence might be. Fletcher's military experience told him that they had already decided he was either an asset to be used or an obstacle to be removed. "Well now," Fletcher said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "That sounds almost like a threat. And I've got to tell you, gentlemen, I don't respond well to threats on my own property." The sacred horn seemed to pulse with invisible energy beside the cabin wall, and Fletcher felt the weight of responsibility that came with carrying the hopes of an entire people. These hunters represented everything the memory cloth had shown. Him, the relentless human drive to possess and destroy anything that didn't fit neatly into their understanding of the world. "No threat intended," the guide said, though his hand had moved noticeably closer to his rifle. "Just hoping for cooperation from a fellow outdoorsman. Surely you understand that scientific advancement requires some degree of—" "Scientific advancement," Fletcher interrupted, his voice carrying a new edge that made several of the hunters take a step back. "Is that what we're calling it now?" The morning air grew thick with tension, as both sides recognized that the careful dance of civilized conversation was about to end. Fletcher's hand moved toward the sacred horn, and somewhere in the forest around them, the ancient watchers prepared to learn whether this confrontation would end in understanding or bloodshed. The standoff lasted only seconds before Fletcher made his choice. His weathered fingers closed around the sacred horn, lifting it with the reverence it deserved, while his eyes never left the hunting party. The guide's hand was already moving toward his rifle when Fletcher raised the ancient instrument to his lips and sent its deep, resonant call echoing across the mountains. The sound that emerged was unlike anything the hunters had ever heard, not just noise, but something that seemed to resonate in their bones and stir memories they didn't know they possessed. The call rolled across the valleys like thunder, carrying messages that human ears couldn't decode, but human hearts could somehow understand. It spoke of ancient agreements, of boundaries that had been crossed, of a peace that was about to be shattered by greed and ignorance. What the hell was that? The heavy-set client demanded, his expensive rifle already in his hands. Some kind of signal? Fletcher didn't lower the horn immediately. Instead, he held it like a weapon, though it had never been designed for violence. "That," he said quietly, "was a call for justice. And I think you gentlemen are about to discover what that means in these mountains." The response came faster than even Fletcher had expected. The forest emerged around them like a living entity, massive forms materializing from shadows that had seemed empty moments before. The hunters found themselves surrounded by beings that dwarfed their human frames, creatures that moved with such silent grace that they might have been standing there all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. But these weren't the savage monsters the hunters had expected. The forest people stood with dignity that was unmistakably intelligent, their posture non-threatening, but unmistakably powerful. The matriarch stepped forward from the circle, the child safe in her arms, her ancient eyes fixed on the hunters, with an expression that combined sadness with profound disappointment. Fletcher reached into his pocket and withdrew, something that made the guide's face go pale. Smooth white stone, perfectly round, that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The peace stone was another gift from the matriarch, meant to be used only in moments when violence threatened to destroy any possibility of understanding. "Gentlemen," Fletcher said, placing the peace stone on the ground between himself and the hunters, "I invoke the old laws. This stone marks sacred ground where no blood may be shed, where grievances must be heard before weapons are drawn. Even you city folk must have heard the stories." The guide's face showed that he had indeed heard the stories. Legends passed down through generations of mountain men about certain places and certain objects that commanded respect even from the hardest frontiersmen. The peace stone wasn't just folklore. It was a reality that predated human settlement in these mountains, a law older than any government or territorial claim. "You're protecting them," the heavy-set client said, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "You're harboring dangerous animals that could threaten settlements." "Animals?" Fletcher's voice carried a heat that made several hunters step back. "Look at them. Really look. Do those eyes look animal to you? Do animals create art, raise families, communicate with the complexity you've witnessed here?" The child in the matriarch's arms chose that moment to demonstrate exactly how non-animal these beings were. The little one reached out toward the frightened hunters, making soft sounds that were unmistakably attempts at communication. Its eyes, so remarkably human despite its unusual appearance, held no fear or aggression, only curiosity about these strange new beings who had disrupted the morning peace. One of the younger hunters, a man who looked barely old enough to be away from his family, lowered his rifle with hands that shook. "My God," he whispered, "it's trying to talk to us. It's just a baby, and it's trying to talk." The moment of recognition spread through the hunting party like wildfire. These men had come expecting to capture primitive beasts, but they found themselves face to face with intelligence that rivaled their own. The child's innocent attempt at communication shattered their preconceptions more effectively than any argument Fletcher could have made. The matriarch stepped forward, still carrying her child, and knelt beside the peace stone. Her massive hands moved with careful precision as she arranged translation stones around its perimeter, creating a message that even humans could understand. The symbols spoke of peace, of shared understanding, of the possibility that two intelligent species could coexist without violence. The guide found his voice first. "The people who hired us," he said slowly, "they never told us they were intelligent. They said we were tracking dangerous predators, threats to human settlement." Fletcher nodded grimly. "And who exactly hired you?" "Because I'm thinking they knew exactly what you'd find up here. And they counted on you not asking too many questions once the shooting started." The peace stone pulsed with gentle light as it sat between the two groups, creating a sanctuary where truth could be spoken without fear. Around them, the forest people maintained their respectful distance, living proof that intelligence and wisdom came in forms that human civilization had never learned to recognize or accept. The moment hung in perfect balance, teetering between violence and understanding, between the continuation of ancient hatred and the possibility of something entirely new. 3 months later, Fletcher sat on his porch, watching the child, now walking with confident steps and chattering in a mixture of its peoples, language, and the human words Fletcher had been teaching, explore the garden with boundless curiosity. The little one had grown remarkably in the weeks since the confrontation, not just physically, but in its ability to bridge the gap between two very different worlds. The hunting party had departed that same day, their expedition abandoned not through force, but through the simple recognition that they had been sent to capture beings whose intelligence and peaceful nature made such action unconscionable. The guide, a man named Morrison, had stayed behind long enough to help Fletcher understand the scope of the threat they had all faced. The expedition had been financed by private collectors who specialized in acquiring specimens that science hadn't yet catalogued, men who cared nothing for the intelligence or rights of their targets. Morrison had taken upon himself the task of ensuring that no such expedition would threaten the forest people again. He returned to the cities with stories that painted the mountains as dangerous and unprofitable, filled with natural hazards that made any significant expedition too costly to attempt. The forest people's existence would remain their own secret, protected by the same myths and legends that had sheltered them for generations. The matriarch approached the porch, carrying something Fletcher had never seen before, a braided cord made from intertwined strands of human and forest people hair, its surface gleaming with oils that caught the afternoon sunlight. She presented it to Fletcher with ceremony that spoke of deep significance, placing it around his wrist with the care reserved for sacred objects. "A friendship bracelet," Fletcher said softly, understanding immediately what the artifact represented. The bracelet wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of permanent bond between himself and the forest people, marking him as family in a way that transcended species barriers. The intertwined hair represented the joining of two very different forms of life into something stronger than either could achieve alone. The matriarch's translation stones told him that he was now considered an elder among her people, a bridge between worlds who could speak for them in situations where direct contact might prove dangerous. Other groups of forest people throughout the mountains had been told of the human who stood with them against the hunters, who protected their young and honored their sacred traditions. Fletcher's role as guardian had evolved naturally over the weeks following the confrontation. His cabin had become a meeting place where forest people from distant territories could gather safely, sharing information about human activities that might threaten their hidden communities. His enhanced maps now contained details about safe routes that spanned thousands of square miles, turning his simple hermit's dwelling into the headquarters of a vast protective network. The child had become the symbol of this new cooperation, equally comfortable with human tools and forest people traditions. Fletcher watched the little one demonstrate the use of his hand axe to several young forest people who had come to visit, then immediately switched to their own techniques for working with stone and wood. The child was growing up bilingual and bicultural, equally at home in both worlds. The transformation in Fletcher's own life had been profound. The hollow ache that had driven him to these mountains 3 years ago had been replaced by a sense of purpose he had never expected to find. His carved family portrait still sat on the mantel, but now it was joined by gifts from the forest people, woven fabrics that held light, carved stones that told stories, and small tokens that marked his acceptance into extended families throughout the region. His daily routines now included responsibilities that would have seemed impossible just months before. He maintained communication networks that allowed isolated forest people groups to coordinate their movements and share warnings about potential threats. He served as a translator for concepts that didn't exist in both cultures, helping bridge gaps in understanding that had persisted for generations. Most importantly, Fletcher had become the keeper of hope for a people who had almost forgotten that coexistence with humans was possible. Young forest people visited his cabin to learn about human ways, not to become human themselves, but to understand how to interact safely with the expanding human world. In return, they taught Fletcher their profound connection to the natural world, their sustainable ways of living that left no trace, their deep wisdom about the interconnectedness of all life. The sunset painted the mountains in familiar shades of gold and amber as Fletcher reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken. He had come to these mountains seeking escape from human connection, but he had found instead a deeper form of family than he had ever imagined possible. The forest people had given him purpose, belonging, and the knowledge that his life could matter in ways that extended far beyond his own survival. The child approached the porch carrying a small carved figure that looked remarkably like Fletcher himself, complete with his beard and weathered features. The little one presented it with obvious pride, babbling explanations in its mixed language about the gift it had made for its human grandfather. Fletcher accepted the carving with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that he was holding proof of love that transcended every boundary that had once seemed insurmountable. As night settled over the mountains, Fletcher heard the distant sounds of the forest people preparing for their evening activities, soft calls that carried across the valleys, the gentle rustle of families settling into their hidden camps, the quiet sounds of a civilization that had learned to live in harmony with the world around them. He was no longer alone in the wilderness, no longer isolated by grief and loss. The friendship bracelet on his wrist caught the last rays of sunlight, its intertwined strands symbolizing the permanent bond that now connected him to something larger and more meaningful than his individual existence. Fletcher had found his way home, not to a place, but to a family that spanned species and challenged every assumption about what it meant to belong. In saving one lost child, he had discovered his own path to redemption and purpose in a world that still held room for miracles, if one only had the courage to recognize them when they appeared.